Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the SERA Space Collective, a show where we will be talking to entrepreneurs, scientists, technologists, and community activists from around the world who are shaping the future of humanity's imminent expansion into the cosmos. I'm Sam Hutchison, your host and co-founder of SERA, which we built to give everyone on the planet the opportunity to get involved in space exploration and research. As many of you know, we have an upcoming human spaceflight on Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket, and anybody can apply to be an astronaut and get involved in the space science research that we'll be doing on the flight. In particular on the show, we wanted to focus on stories that come from outside of the historically spacefaring nations and see the ways in which everyone else on the planet getting involved in the space sector is bringing fresh ideas and new perspectives to the way we work. My first guest is Madin Maseeh, who is the founder and president of the Maldivian Space Research Organization. And given that we want to showcase stories to inspire people from regions and backgrounds that have not historically been associated with space, there was no one I wanted to talk to more. Over the last couple of years, Madin has taken MISRO from a community organization to a governmentally recognized national space agency. I hope you enjoyed the show, and thanks for joining us. Hey, Madin.
Hey, Sam.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Anytime.
One of the things that obviously I should say up front is that the way that we first met and the way that we're interacting on a more regular basis is that you're chairing the Small Island Developing States seat that is part of our upcoming mission as chairman and president of MISRO. Thank you so much for that work. That's the disclaimer out of the way. And we can talk more about the mission and why it's significant for the Maldives later on. I wanted to start with a softball, which is, did you always have the space bug? Or was it something that sort of, did you have a eureka moment one day and you thought, this is it, this is the life for me?
Well, I mean, I think that there's two parts to that question. Anyone who grew up in the islands in the Maldives would have had the space bug, because you get these incredibly dark skies, beautiful, filled with stars, in ways that you probably can't see in most major cities around the world. And so I grew up with a fascination for the stars, right? So I would say to some degree, I had the space bug since when I was little. I remember telling my mother that I wanted to grow up and be an astronaut. So I guess it was always in my mind. But then obviously, you grow up and you realize that being an astronaut is not for everyone, and it's not really a career that is widely accessible. But space was always on my mind. I think my eureka moment was completely accidental. But now at MISRO we call it stars align, as we've seen throughout our last 2 years of existence. So it started when I went to the International Space University. And by the way, I went there just because I like space, not because I had any intention of starting any organization. I was at a very comfortable point in my career, and I just wanted to learn. I just wanted to learn something that I enjoyed. And it's when I went there that I realized that space is way bigger and way more exciting than I could have ever imagined. And most importantly, I think space was filled with people who were very interesting and exciting and just wanted to help, right? So that's the kind of people I met at my International Space University. And so I went to the Space Studies program in 2022 in Portugal, in Lisbon, Portugal. And really that's when all this happened. It wasn't honestly my idea to begin with even. It was a question that just started, that gained momentum, became a meme. Everybody started asking, Maldives should have its own space agency, or Maldives should be in the space sector. It just makes sense. And so I decided to call back home to Niaz, who's my co-founder and also my best friend for many years. And he just helped make this happen. And long story short, here we are today, right? Just completely unplanned. But I think it was always kind of destined to be that way, just because the space sector is filled with people like that.
And in terms of that first step in your journey, what was the sort of application process like for joining the university, and how is that course structured, and how did it impact the way that you thought about, one, how did it lead to the inspiration that the Maldives should have its own space agency, and what did it equip you with, and how can people get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I would say everyone should apply to the ISU, not just to the ISU, right? Any organization or entity that's providing some form of space education is great. But the ISU is unique for a couple of reasons. One is it's probably one of the largest alumni network. Buzz Aldrin was one of the I think chancellors. So it's an organization that's existed for a long time. And one of the biggest advantages you get if you study in the ISU is you get access to other alumni that honestly are some of the leading figures in the space industry across the globe, right? So that's a huge advantage. But in terms of application, so ISU has a couple of programs. I applied for the really intensive summer program, which lasts around 9 weeks. There's also a master's program, which anyone who wants to take a kind of a more prolonged phase, more focused, is also quite a good option. The SSP, which is the Space Studies program, in my opinion, was perfect for what I needed, because I needed something quick but something really intense. And SSP was designed to really give you the full breadth of the space sector. It was very interdisciplinary, very international, from various nationalities, various backgrounds, and it was a crash course in space in a way that I didn't expect was possible. And I understood the importance of humanities, policy, engineering, applications, law, and all of these like interconnected. Right? It wasn't siloed. All of us were discussing space all the time. So it was an incredible experience. And honestly, I don't think without that kind of melting pot and interdisciplinary approach, the idea of how this could benefit Maldives would have come about. And it's open to everyone, right? So here, SSB happens in a different location. This year, it's happening in South Korea. We have a Maldivian that's actually um, going to join this program, so that's great. So the number of Maldivians joining ISU is also increasing. And honestly, if you're anyone who wants to get into space, whether you want to start an agency or not, ISU and SSB, it's a great starting point. And from there, you can figure out what specialization.
And what was your background for people? For example, myself, I actually did a degree in philosophy of science, and I was interested in the sort of sociological activity around technology and research, and so it was a pretty sort of winding path into space in the long term. What was your background academically or professionally before you went to LSU? For people who feel you have to be a rocket scientist to get involved in the space sector, what are your words of advice, and what was your experience?
Absolutely not. I mean, I have a very colorful, very varied background. So I studied and graduated in international and strategic studies. So a lot of politics, a lot of IR, strategy, history as well to some degree. But I also had a background in chemical engineering. I did a few years of chemical engineering. But then from chemical engineering, I changed to IR because I just felt like international studies was so much more interesting for me. But then in my free time during university, I did a lot of hackathons, participated in probably like 15 hackathons, and then I found out that I was very good at it. I actually joined. Interestingly, before SSB, I joined a NASA Space Apps hackathon, which is one of those global NASA Space Apps hackathon, and I was one of the global winners in 2017. Which I don't think I've told you this before, Sam. But
congratulations!
Yeah, so yeah, it was an interesting idea about leveraging satellite data for vertical farming. For anyone interested, we can share the link later. But I dabbled myself into various different types of hackathons and found myself to be very interested in and good at data science. So I pursued my career in data science, but still always interested in space and the space security conversations. So when I joined SSP, I was already working as a data scientist and business intelligence for a
And
few years.
I imagine that your background in political relations and international relations has helped you in terms of transitioning from a community grassroots organization to a government recognized space agency, which is extraordinary.
I would imagine so. I would definitely imagine so. I used to partake in a lot of Model UN as well. So
you're one of those
playing
guys.
role, well, for a little bit. So
Sure.
I used to join a lot of. So I had a Model UN phase, and then I had a hackathon phase. Actually, in between both, I used to do both. But I really enjoyed Model UN. I enjoyed the idea of trying to understand how can we find a mutually beneficial conclusion, even with very kind of contrasting foreign policy stances, right? I would definitely attribute a lot of my thinking when I approach like the government, when I approach stakeholders to that experience. Obviously, not entirely to that. There was a lot of help as well, but I would imagine that definitely helped. It made me feel a lot less nervous about meeting figures in the government, and I had already done some work with government over the years before, and so I was already familiar with the figures that I needed to talk to.
So if we just back up, as I mentioned to you, in the pre-call, I really want this to be a 101 for people who are in regions or nations that have no governmental or even private sort of space infrastructure, who are sitting there thinking, number one, maybe the only way for me to sort of get actively involved in the space sector is to emigrate. I don't like that. We don't want that. We want people to be developing space infrastructure, companies and research, where they're from in a way that reflects the values and the challenges and the objectives of that specific place. So walk us through step by step, like how did this really come about? I mean, you said you had a background in international relations. You went to ISU. You understood the space sector better. Presumably, you saw ways in which your existing background, which was not space specific, could play in space. And then what happened? Walk us through step by step, because I want people out there to understand that, even if you're in a place where you feel the only option is to move, that's not the only option, and it's not the best option. And I think the model that you've pursued is replicable and just a phenomenally sort of disruptive approach to how sort of international collaboration or just the whole framework for the way that the sort of global space sector works, as opposed to this sort of centralized model where everyone's focused on one or two major international programs. We hopefully will be seeing activity sort of in a sort of hub and spoke model.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think the first really crucial approach that we cemented, and none of these were at the time obvious. These were all very emergent, and I think to a large degree, Mesro's organizational philosophy is designed for emergence, right? Like we don't try to create really strong structures or rules, especially because if the problem statement is how do you make a nation like the Maldives have one of the space agencies, or how do you make the Maldives one of the leading space faring nations in the world? There's no rule book for that, right? So whatever has been done anywhere else would not work for us, which means we have to make sure that we design ourselves to be nimble, agile, and adaptive to growing realities, especially in the kind of turbulent world we live in. But I would say one of the, retrospectively, now that we look back, one of the crucial decisions we made was to position ourselves in a to frame ourselves in a position of power. Maldives has, for the longest time, always positioned ourselves in a kind of a place of weakness. We need help because we are sinking, or because of climate change we are suffering. Therefore, help us. I think during the ISU's time, it was very evident to me that we had so much to offer. we're on the equator, we have a large ocean. And so right after ISE, we went to the ISU, we went to the ISE. The first ISE we went to was in Paris, 2022, which happened to be in September. So just a month after our program ended, I went straight to ISE. By the time we had already registered this NGO called Molder Space Research Organization, and we had
That's
nothing.
step one. I just want to really break this down. Step one was have a concept of what this organization, needed to look like. Step two was you generated a narrative that you felt ran counter to the way that the Maldives had historically considered its role in this sort of activity. Step three was actually do something about it, and that was found an NGO.
Yeah, and the NGO bit was obviously very specific to the Maldives, but the same principle could apply anywhere. You'll need something people can gravitate towards, whether it's an NGO or a private company or a private not-for-profit, depends on your specific context, right? Each country has its own legal structure when it comes to these entities. But in the Maldives, NGOs work great. The messaging was clear that we are here not to make a profit. This was not for the purpose of creating a company or a specific product. This was to bring an ecosystem, a new sector to the Maldives that did not exist before. And so the NGO entity worked really well in that at the time period. And then we went to ISE. So ISE was very crucial because ISE is where...
Back up, Madin. I want to make sure everyone knows what the ISE is and why it's kind of central to the way that the space sector works.
Yeah, so the ISE is the International Astronautical Congress. So it's probably the largest gathering of space sector people, space nerds, space geeks every year. So I think in Paris, there were around 9,000 people attended, incredible amount of exhibitors. And in a single place, we were able to really network, understand what the space sector was looking for, but also be able to say, there's something we could collaborate on. Now, we didn't go in there just by ourselves, right? One of the advantages of having gone to ISU again was ISU was hosted by Portugal Space in Portugal. So we already had some allies. We had Portugal Space who we could leverage as someone who can introduce us. But I also had that ISU pin that made conversations easier. So it's important to go into a conference like ISE, one, with a vision of what you want to do. You don't need to have a plan, but you need to at least have a vision. And two, have some form of leverage. If you have no leverage, it's going to be very hard, especially in that kind of environment, to start meaningful discussions, right? And so we just started the discussions on like, hey, Maldives is in space. What can we do together? And we would use things we learned from the previous day and the next day, and so we built momentum on momentum. And so, we call it exponential leverage, right? We use one leverage to the other. And what we found out was we became really good at connecting partners. Partners who didn't...
You're a good talker, Madin. I met you at the ISE, so yeah. For sure.
Well, that was the second time around, right? Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. But it all comes from a genuine belief. And this is very important, right? If you're genuine in what you believe in and what you're advocating for, people will pick it up. And we had no doubt. So I went there with a couple of other internationals who were not even Maldivian. At this point, we only had 2 Maldivians, but almost everyone in my space studies program were pretty much an ally or somehow involved in MESRA. And so we went with a couple of my colleagues, and they all helped as if they were part of this mission. And I think that really helped, right? So ISE became like that launchpad, force multiplier, where we finally kind of were able to identify a couple of key partners who could help put together a pilot that we could run in the Maldives as the first moment of, in the history of our nation where a proper space-focused pilot was conducted. Even then, it was still very much focused on Earth observation and the environment, because we had to root our pilot in what the locals needed, what the local problems were. And so I think in February 2023, we executed the pilot. But it was started at ISE, and between ISE and the pilot, we had a couple of other discussions with different partners, but we kept really building our international partnerships, through these interactions and networking, while also speaking to the local side. And so it was important to make sure that you build hedges on both sides. You need to make sure you have a strong international partnership so that the local side saw the value in what you're bringing. Because, if one of the biggest fears that anyone has when they're starting a new space entity or an agency where there's none is, what if the government comes in and replaces us? Well, the government is way too busy doing other things than to replace you if you bring in value first, right? And so what we did was we really emphasized on bringing in partners with MOUs or with the desire to work with us, so that the government would find it much harder to replace us and find another group that were already at the same point we were at. So I think that really helped.
And can I just
you want to?
no, I was going
Yeah.
to just ask, how did that play? Because I think that's a really key concept. So again, just to back up, you've got a compelling vision, you flip the narrative on its head, you've identified an event, IAC, where you think you can build partnerships, create allies. You presumably have identified challenges that the Maldives have that, in a sense, in the Maldives seem like problems, but to the space community could be opportunities, whether that's business or partnership or whatever it is. At what actual point did you initially talk with the government about some of the challenges that it was having, or were they ones that you identified yourself in a sort of more entrepreneurial way?
No, I mean, so because of my previous work on and off with the government, I was already very closely aware of some of the challenges. But some of these challenges you don't even have to have worked with government to recognize, right? Like we have the issue of the climate crisis impacting us in various ways: shoreline, coastal erosion, coral bleaching. So there were some problems that were quite obvious, but then there were also problems that I knew because of my proximity or just my previous work, right? And one of that was really understanding the importance of space to the maritime security, to illegal fishing. Maldives is a small landmass compared to its ocean. So we're a big ocean nation instead of a small island state. And so one of my first local meetings was set up with the Minister of Defense at that time. So she just happened to be someone I had access to at the time. And again, this was purely stars aligned. And I requested, I pitched to her saying that, hey, I went to the ISU. There's an entire space community willing to help the Maldives and bring the benefit of space. I think this will really benefit defense. And so she gave me an opportunity to pitch to her. And so the meeting was set, but before I went to the meeting, I had already met the partners in ISC. And so that's what I mean about you have to work on two fronts at the same time, which is going to be very key. And again, you have to do this in a manner that is very, very genuine, because partners, they will not tolerate if someone is trying to obviously waste their time, right? I mean, these are incredibly well-established organizations with very little time. And so the way we pitch is like you rightly identified, we have problems, but we spin it off in a way that we say, look, if you're looking for problems, we can give you problems, right? Like space companies need to prove the value of space technology, and we have a lot of problems. You can prove them, and also it's one of the appeals of the Maldives is because it's the Maldives. We already had the inherent association people have with beautiful beaches, ocean. So we used it to our advantage. We invited people to come over to have a discussion, and so I think the other key piece of advice, I guess, to anyone else starting something similar would be look around you and find what you can use as your strength. Pretty sure everyone would have that, and play from that position rather than we need help because we're a developing nation, because there's so many other nations just like that. And so after ISC, meeting the Ministry of Defense was the next key, I would say, decision we made that really helped, again, accelerate our journey to where we are today.
And I think one of the things that I've heard you talk about before is you started off sort of identifying problems, but you've also identified a number of opportunities that are unique to the Maldives. For example, in terms of weather prediction, your unique position. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we are on the equator. We are part of the Indian Ocean. There's a couple of elements to it, right? One is we need really accurate, localized weather prediction. because our islands are very small compared to the ocean. The oceans are dynamic. 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer models just do not cut it sometimes, and usually we don't even get that much. And so there was a need for more localized, more accurate, more real-time weather. And so again, space data coupled with ground data was a critical piece to that. But on top of that, the opportunity that Maldives could provide here is because we are located in the equator, and hurricanes or typhoons that get formed that go to the mainland India actually form southwest, I guess, somewhere around there of Maldives. And so by having better observations in our own region, we can contribute to regional weather prediction as well. Now, obviously, this is something we cannot do by ourselves. We have to work with other meteorological offices and other space organizations within the region. But again, it shows that every country is interconnected to another in one way, shape, or form, and it's about finding the right leverage. And so we can now approach any regional, weather organization or space organization and say, hey, we can provide you data that will benefit your models if you can provide us with, let's say, imagery or data or expertise. And so we can find out what are we good at, which we have really good coastal engineers. We have great surveyors. We can help collect the ground data that satellite companies often need, where we don't have satellites, but they do. And so it's about finding that synergy, right? And so we found ourselves in that sweet spot, I would say, pretty early on.
I think it's a really good example for people. You start with what you think is a set of problems. You explore, through the sort of conversations you have, what the solutions to that problem are. Then you better understand what the solutions to your challenges are, and you understand that some of your challenges are actually opportunities for other people, and that's how you get this flywheel of partnership and cooperation to turn.
Absolutely, yeah.
No, yeah.
And one of the beauties of this approach and working with partners is fundamentally we believe in working with partners and consortiums are just the better way to do than doing it alone, than trying to reinvent the wheel. But when we do it, we still do it in a manner that's again genuine, right? Like we will genuinely try to bring the value that we can, while leveraging the international partnerships and the strengths that they have. But in the process, we also discover new things, and I would say that's probably how we ended up talking, and
Sure.
why it was so interesting, right? Like, I mean, we knew that at some point we needed to go out beyond just the Earth observation domain, because and one of the rationales behind that was, if we were just an Earth observation focused organization, we would not truly be a space organization. We could easily be classified as a data organization, as an environmental organization. And so from the very beginning, we knew that this was just the way to get started, but this was not. I mean, the whole reason we started Mesra was because we believe that Maldives have always been good start, right? We wanted to genuinely contribute to space exploration, and that it was part of our gene, part of our blood to actually do so as well. And so what that meant was we were always kind of thinking, how do we connect our problems to the next domains of space, right? Like to the next level. And that's kind of where microgravity was an interesting thing. And when I met you and Josh, we talked about sending corals to space, and we were surprised that Maldives had not done that before, but surprised no other country had sent one to, let's say, for example, the ISS. But it started with a genuine desire to genuine recognition that the corals are important to Maldives, to other atoll nations, and that space has something to offer beyond just observation, that we can actually learn more about these programs. So again, it's like the same set of problems. You can keep expanding them. We don't limit it to just the tried and tested approaches.
No, I think obviously something we've spoken about before that I feel very strongly is that my background is in orbital space propulsion, and certainly in the early 2000s there was a lot of snobbishness about suborbital flights, and one of the things that's become very clear to us is that it's actually a phenomenal opportunity, particularly for regions and nations that maybe don't have the budget to buy a full orbital mission. One, to grow your organization around, right, in terms of getting used to what the process of putting a space flight, whether research or human space flight together looks like. And secondly, you can design experiments for suborbital payloads that have tremendous value to the future of orbital research and human activity in space, whether that's scientific or human or whatever it is. So I think I feel very strongly that people tend to undervalue the real the potential of suborbital research to start to build expertise at a price point that is, palatable for regions and nations that have smaller budgets. So no, I couldn't agree more.
And I think there's two very important things with respect to that, right? One is, I think the reason there has been this skeptical, snobbish attitude towards that. One is because people don't understand the kind of experiments that are sent. Like some of these biology experiments are extremely technical. Only for those who are really in the field they would understand that. But the opportunity there again for a nation like ours is we can bring it down to earth, in a manner of speaking. We can connect it to a real world impact. We can say the reason we're studying corals is it's important to study them generally, but like we're trying to figure out if we can learn something that can help us combat climate change. I think the opportunity for nations like ours is we can start to change the perspective about microgravity by bringing in these kind of problems. But the second bit is it's expensive because we are not in the picture, right? If we had a suborbital program with the perspective of the developing nations, smaller developing states, our programs would be at a different price point, right? Because we would prioritize things in a way that would be affordable for one ourselves, but also to nations like ours. So I think we have a responsibility to partake in that. And again, that's the position of power that I'm speaking about, right? Like it's not just that we would love for someone to give us a good, well-priced suborbital flight. We should start to actively contribute, and we can, and that's what the space sector is looking for.
Let's just take that as a really good example. In the same way that people listening to this around the world may be sitting there thinking, "What can I do?" Well, you are the living embodiment of what can be done. In the same way, do you think it's the case that other nations that have historically not had active space programs are looking at what's going on in the suborbital sector and generating genuine ambition to develop their own systems? Is that something that you guys are looking at? Is that something you want to do?
We're still at the early stages, so suborbital is in the roadmap. Something that we aspire towards, whether it be developing our own or bring in international suborbital launch providers. That is to be determined. We're working closely with Ministry of Defense and the government in general to make sure that we align with national priorities as well. But generally speaking, I think it is something that the sector needs, and so it might just be one of those things that emerge that Maldives actually contributes significantly. Whether it be our own launch system or maybe the allocation to launch from these smaller suborbital vehicles, and collect incredibly important data points, right? That will help the entire ecosystem.
And is that something, again, now that you've established MISRO, you're presumably looking at collaboration with other nation states that share similar challenges as well throughout?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we obviously at any point in time we are always keen to collaborate with other states because we understand the challenges and we would love to continue collaboration to facilitate whether it be the development of their own space sector or just solving some specific problems. But it's not just SIDS. We've talked to entities in Costa Rica, for example, who are doing similar suborbital biomedical research or bioastronautics research in general, and we are actively trying to find ways to work with them. Sometimes we may not initially understand what exactly we can do together, but the way we've always operated is if our kind of principles align and if we have a generally the same direction we are working towards, we know that there's a force multiplier that can be achieved. And so I would say absolutely should be working together. Other developing nations, the SIDS as well. And I think that's the only way that we can achieve some of those removal of barriers to this market as well.
And what do you think? I'm fond of a couple of statistics about space exploration and research. One is that around 86% of all astronauts have come from just 3 countries, and I did a deep dive and put an Excel spreadsheet together around in-space assets, and it turns out that about the same number of countries own over 80% of all the in-space infrastructure. As we see more nations from different parts of the world getting involved in either international missions like Artemis, or as you've done, starting their own space programs. This is a double-sided question. Number one, how do you think that is going to change the way that we think about space? So the flip of the question is, how do you think the fact that space has historically been dominated by a small number of specific nations has shaped the whole approach to the way we go about space exploration and research?
So, I guess I'll start with the historical bit, right? Like, how has it shaped, or what's my thoughts on that? I guess I think it was probably what we needed to accelerate the space sector.
Mm-hmm.
The smaller, big but few number of nations and their rivalry with their military powers definitely accelerated the amount of development that we had in the space sector. But the future of space exploration definitely is more inclusive. Getting off the planet might have been beneficial by these developments, but truly exploring the cosmos, and even in our own backyard, requires everyone to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is there's a couple of reasons, right? The obvious one is obviously the technical challenges, the policy discussions require multiple perspectives. I think there's a very valuable case to be made here that a country like the Maldives, countries like SIDS, our perspectives can help make space exploration more responsible. And so, I'm not a fan of the narrative that we should be shunning space exploration because there are problems on the Earth. I think we should be taking part in these conversations, providing our perspective, so that when they are responsible, it also benefits Earth, right? Because at the end of the day, the amount of money we spend collectively on space exploration is nothing compared to the rest of the industries. But
Sure.
the amount of benefit it brings, be it utilitarian or be it just purely from a art perspective or the human experience perspective, I think is invaluable. And obviously, this is my own subjective opinion, but I also think that there's a lot of merit to that. And so it's very important that we take part in that. And this is what the space sector needs right now, especially around conversations revolving around the moon, right? Like, how do we, what are some of the policies or space security conversations we need to have around the moon? Countries like the Maldives has valuable perspectives. The other bit is, and again, this has to do with perspective, but one of the advantages of being a country surrounded by ocean that is far larger than the amount of land we have is we know the challenges of space in a very different sense. Like, although it's not a strictly one-to-one analogy, when you're in a small island and you're exploring a vast amount of the ocean, you have limited resources in terms of the number of personnel in the Coast Guard, for example, protecting a larger area of the ocean. There are lessons to be learned that the space sector can benefit from when thinking about policies about space, right? And so it's not just purely because we have a perspective that brings in more responsibility, but I also think that the added perspectives of nations like ours can enhance the way we develop space exploration, the identity of space exploration moving forward. We might be able to tackle problems that the typical usual suspects may not be able to, right? Just because we believe that we are far longer. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, that's really where my question was going, which is, I've always had in the back of my mind a slight concern that when people talk about the expansion of space activity globally and more nations and regions getting involved, that they're not challenging the old way of doing things. They're basically saying, we want to do what they're doing. We want to do it like they're doing it.
Yeah.
Right. So what do
That's
we
actually a
think?
very good point. If I may just add one thing there,
Mm.
Sam. Um, One thing that we realized very quickly early on is we didn't want to follow the typical pathway laid out to us by, whenever we ask someone, how do we get into space? They'll be like, oh, build a CubeSat, follow this
Yeah.
program. We were like, why are we building CubeSats? We need real solutions to real problems, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
CubeSats are great. I mean, don't get me
Hmm.
wrong, if you want to build capacity, but there was no way that just getting our local students to know how to build a CubeSat bring in the benefits that space has offer, right? And so, for some countries, CubeSats might be the absolutely the right first step. But I think the
Hmm.
key here is, like you said, do not follow a cookie cutter template. Look really deeply, introspect, and figure out what do we actually need, and then build your own roadmap or your own pathway. And the pathway might be completely against the traditional wisdom, which is fine, because that's the beauty of the space, right? There's so many different ways to do it. But yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that.
I think the most obvious area where it's very easy to follow the existing model is you've got to build your own launch system, right? And I think obviously over the last 15, 20 years, uh, with the advent of SpaceX, Blue Origin, and other launch companies, they challenged the existing model, right? The existing model was um, defense requirements drive development budgets for rocket propulsion systems that can do a number of things, including putting payloads in orbit. They're built a certain way, the cost is so high, this is the only way it can be done. And therefore, we just have to piggyback off that existing infrastructure. Now we have a new launch infrastructure that is competitive, that competition is fostering innovation. It's also inspiring entrepreneurs around the world to say, hey, I can build my own rocket. There isn't a month that goes by that you don't see news about a new rocket startup that's got a different twist on how to, continue to lower the cost of access to space. So, do you think it's let's leave the launch piece of this up to a competitive global market to drive innovation, to continue to to continue to drive costs down, and let's think about innovative as an agency. We need to think about innovative ways to utilize that, or is there always a sort of is there always a part of everyone who's into space which is really should build my own rocket at this point?
Well,
But it's
I mean,
expensive, and
absolutely, yeah. I mean, I would say, to answer your question, I don't think everyone should be thinking about building their own especially if if you are in a country where ride sharing from a SpaceX Falcon or in the future
sure.
Starship is readily available, right? I mean, it just makes no sense. I mean, you're getting a fraction, you're getting the same amount of benefit for a fraction of the cost compared to
Yeah.
a few years ago even. But I think there's an interesting case to be made for some of the more nuanced areas. So, for example, all this is on the equator, right? If we need an
Mhm.
equatorial constellation, we don't have rideshare to the equator. Now, whether that be a launch system problem or a launch business model problem, I think
Mhm.
that's kind of open to discussion, right? Like now, a launch company might come and say, we just want to do equatorial launches, right? Or we could partner with a launch company and bring them to additional spaceports around the equator through some collaboration. But I think the launch industry is not fully cracked yet, especially around this equatorial piece, because the equator is a critical piece to any launch. Historically, we just haven't had that much attention, because if you look around the equator, you don't have countries that are too wealthy or too powerful. Um, but the equator is where you get the fastest delta to space as well, right? And yeah, it's going to be interesting, especially
Mhm.
with I mean, Starship has a SpaceX has an ambition of launching a lot of Starships in space. We don't have enough spaceports today to cater that demand, or at least enough launch windows, right? And so I think the launch vehicle question probably is coupled with spaceports as well, and also launch locations
Mhm.
in general. So I'm gonna keep a kind of an open mind to this, but I do agree that 90% of time you should not be looking at building anything regarding launch, especially because the cost of launch is so much. But there still probably would be areas of innovation, at least around the periphery. that
No,
we should
I
expect?
think my hope is that as more regions get involved and understand space, that to the extent that there is international collaboration, it's focused on global challenges and global opportunities. Obviously, there's a lot of people who've been riveted by this. Is it going to hit us? Is it not going to hit us? Asteroid that NASA and others have been tracking. It does highlight the point that we don't currently have a global response to challenges like asteroids, right? We don't currently have a global framework for collaboration around sort of commercial utilization of in-space resources. And my personal hope is that that's what the next 10, 20 years is going to, start to see, where there's big infrastructure pieces that either represent an opportunity or a challenge, or a threat.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, only now we are properly discussing or addressing the question around pollution in our orbits, right? Space debris and orbital traffic management. I know that the UNUSA currently, with the current director, is really focused on trying to solve the problem and make sure that our orbits are maintained and used responsibly. And so I think that a lot of the conversations and the questions around the topics you brought up are kind of interlinked with the conversations that are happening in the UN as well. And so I'm also very hopeful that the next decade would be really trying to make the most out of the assets we already have. And I think, in terms of like planetary defense, right? Again, this is an area where a country like ours has so much to offer. Like with our dark skies, with our flat access to horizon and the equator, we have a large piece of the sky to observe. And so we should be contributing to planetary defense by having telescopes and other sensors on the ground. So, and that is something that is in horizon as well. But again, that's where I think when countries like ours show up and we start to have these conversations, we contribute, then the other countries will start to listen as well. And so we have a role to play in this. And yeah, I'm excited. Just as you.
No, I hope so. I know we're running out of time, so just to bring it back to where we started, what sort of single piece or set of advice would you have for people listening around the world who want to get into space, live in a country that is poor in space educational resources, where there's no commercial space activity or governmental activity? What's our step-by-step guide to ending up as the president of a national space agency in 2 to 3 years?
Well, I mean, we are government authorized and recognized, but we're not an agency. Perhaps for the best as well. But no, I mean, to your point, I think I'll start with the fundamental premise that I think powers everything is, um, I can't speak for other sectors, but at least for the space sector, I think you have to recognize that almost everything we've achieved in the space sector, history of space sector, was achieved against all odds, right? Every time you try to achieve something, people were skeptical. They didn't believe we'll go to the moon. They didn't believe we'll have reusable rockets. You can count almost every trajectory, even how NASA kind of became NASA of today, or the NASA of a couple of years ago, was against all odds. And it was against all odds because every single step of the way, people had to invent a new way of doing something. Channel that approach, I would say. When you're starting something in space, space is hard, and that means you have to be very innovative. You have to be completely open-minded. You have to completely flip the rule book. May not work for every other industry, but at least for the space sector, I would say, because of the very nature of doing space, don't be afraid to be bold and audacious in the way you approach things, because otherwise you just can't crack space. Yeah, it's so hard that you need the most innovative approaches to do it. I think we've lived through a couple of those historical moments to be confident that is the case. But in terms of the next steps, I think strengthen your foundation. Have a very clear vision. Um, if you say you want to do space because you think it's cool, it's probably not going to be enough. Have a genuine belief that what you're doing is what the country needs, or what would benefit whatever smaller subset you're working towards. and then build the flesh around it, like build it from all different directions, bring in the right people who resonate with the vision, and when you speak to partners and building partnerships, again, space sector, the fuel is collaboration.
Yeah.
You have countries that would never work together in any other sector,
Mhm.
working together as
Yeah.
equal partners in space sector. And so build fundamentally around partnerships and think global, right? Like you might build local, but think global. Like we are all global citizens when it comes to space. And so don't limit yourselves to where you're working today in terms of seeking help. Seek advice. Honestly, in my opinion, I think when you go to ISE, when you go to other space conferences, you realize how much energy there is around solving
Mhm.
space together. There might be
Mhm.
politics, there might be things we don't like, there always will be. But I think compared to any other industry, I would be biased to say that space sector has the best vibes, right? The best people. And so leverage that and seek help, find the right people, build leverage, and then use your leverage to build more leverage. And be adaptive. Be agile. Again, the space sector is evolving rapidly. The world is evolving rapidly. You can't be limited by your yesterday's plans. You have to be willing to throw it all out the window in light of new information and go back to the drawing board. If not, you're not going to be able to do space, right? Because again, it's like space is going to challenge you every step of the way. That's kind of and so, yeah, I mean, if you have the resolve to do that and you find the right people, I think that your path will emerge and clear up pretty easily. And yeah, don't give up. It's going to be hard initially, but I think um, you know people like Sam, SERA, they're here to help. They have a much more global mandate than most other space entities as well, and so I'm confident that we have more and more entities emerging that can help people get started. So it wouldn't be from a blank slate as well. So that would be my couple of cents.
It's pretty good. Madin, thank you so much for joining me today, and let's catch up soon.
Yeah, likewise, Sam. Looking forward to seeing you again. Ciao.
Perfect. Oh.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Wait. We may have to. That was
So
great.
nice. Thank you,
I don't
sir.
know if I can see you.
Yeah. I can't see you though, but
I can't see you
same.
either. No.
Yeah.
Hey, listen. I think that's perfect. I mean, it's. I've never done this